You might think pirates spent their days swinging from rigging and shouting at passing ships or buried chests full of gold on tropical islands. But here's a secret. Pirates had a bigger problem than cannonballs and sword fights. Their deadliest enemy wasn't the Royal Navy or rival buccaneers. It was fresh water. Yes, that clear, boring liquid we all take for granted was a constant nightmare for these swashbucklers. Let me tell you something fascinating and a little gross about how pirates survived on seawater, or tried to, anyway. And trust me, the solutions they came up with were equal parts ingenious, disgusting, and downright hilarious. Picture this. You're aboard a pirate ship in the early 1700s, maybe riding the waves off the Caribbean or near the Spanish Main. You've got a crew of 50 rough-and-tumble pirates who each need at least 1 gallon of fresh water daily just to stay alive and keep those scurvy gums from falling out. That's 50 gallons of water needed every day, but you're surrounded by nothing but salty ocean. Now, you can't exactly open your mouth and slurp salt water. It'll dehydrate you faster than you can say, walk the plank. That salty nectar contains about 3.5% salt, and drinking it even once can lead to kidney failure, dehydration, and a one-way ticket to Davy Jones' locker. So what's a savvy seafarer to do? Spoiler alert, it wasn't as simple as bringing barrels of water aboard before setting sail, because fresh water stores ran out quickly, and refilling them could be impossible on long voyages. The first obvious idea pirates tried was to drink seawater anyway, but bad idea, really bad idea. Let's just say their livers and kidneys were not pleased. Besides the immediate health impact, anyone caught tasting seawater became the brunt of jokes, and talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by having to be carried to the stern with a bucket. You can probably guess how that ended. Crew members quickly becoming weaker, hallucinating, sometimes worse. And with a crew too sick to fight or even steer, the ship was sitting ducks for storms or enemies. Faced with this salty enemy, pirates looked for alternatives in the only place they had, their ship and the ocean itself. Early attempts included catching rainwater in whatever containers were handy, sometimes cloth sails, barrels, even wooden planks lined awkwardly to funnel drops. Rainwater collection was a solid backup plan, but terribly unreliable in the dry Caribbean summers when clouds were scarce and hurricanes knocked everything loose overnight. Because nothing says bad luck like the heavens staying clear just as your 30 gallons of water run dry. One pirate captain, Henry Morgan, legendary for his raids and escapades, once reportedly wasted precious hours trying to rig up a rain collector with bits of cloth and even parts of a captain's coat. Bad idea, really bad idea. The coat was so greasy and salty from the ocean spray, it tainted the rainwater collected, leaving a taste so foul that his crew dubbed it the captain's revenge and refused to drink a drop. Which made sense, because drinking greasy, salty rainwater is basically preparing your insides for a mutiny. Here's where it gets more interesting. Pirates also tried boiling seawater to remove the salt. The theory was simple. Heat seawater until it evaporated, collect the steam, and condense it into drinkable freshwater, like a steamboat making its own water. Turns out pirates accidentally discovered distillation long before it became a science lab staple. The real genius was realizing that evaporated water leaves salt behind. So if you catch the steam in metal or cloth funnels and cool it down, you get fresh water. Problem is, piracy life isn't exactly a lab experiment. They didn't have the fancy equipment or time to set up stills on rocking decks, and fuel for fires was never unlimited. Still, some ships carried makeshift distillers, often made with copper or tin, which could produce up to 10 gallons a day in the best conditions. Surprisingly effective but limited by crew skill and weather. A funny story from the logs of a pirate ship out of Tortuga in 1695 tells of a makeshift still made out of the cook's old kettle and a few scraps of metal. They managed to make a gallon of water after a half-day labor, but it tasted like boiled seaweed and old boots. The crew dubbed it the Sea Witch's Brew and swore it was worse than dehydration itself. Yet, it kept them alive long enough to reach a friendly port. So, it worked, but not without sacrifices to taste buds and morale. Not exactly spa-quality water, but it was their version of a water treatment plant, something no landlubber pirate ever dreamed of needing. Of course, getting clean water also meant avoiding contamination on board. Pirates often kept barrels tethered under covered decks to minimize exposure to sunlight, which encouraged bacteria growth. But even then, barrels filled initially with fresh water could develop a nasty slime over 24 to 48 hours, because ships weren't exactly the Ritz-Carlton of sanitation. Fun fact, sometimes you'd find worms or snails living in the water barrels, turning the potable into the potentially lethal. Pretty disgusting for a bunch of cutthroat seafarers, right? When rainwater and distillation weren't an option, desperate pirates resorted to extracting moisture from food. Fruits like coconuts and melons, when available, were cherished for both their water content and nutrients. On the infamous ship Queen Anne's Revenge, commanded by Blackbeard around 17th well, the crew stockpiled coconuts from island raids as a crucial water reserve. Each coconut can hold roughly 1 cup of fresh liquid, which, while not enough to answer full daily needs, contributed significantly in emergencies. The problem, you'd have to raid tropical islands, and even then, fruit supplies were limited and tempting targets for rival crews. Talk about blending piracy with a fruit scavenger hunt. Let's circle back to alcohol because, yes, pirates drank that a lot: rum, brandy, and more. Here's something history books don't tell you. The reason rum was a staple on pirate ships wasn't just because they enjoyed a good party. Pirates had a bigger problem than running out of fresh water. They had to avoid drinking seawater or diseased water, so rum and other spirits became their substitute hydration method. Now, before you think this sounds logical and responsible, let me burst that bubble. While rum did kill some germs, it's not exactly a replacement for water. In fact, alcohol dehydrates you even more. The logic pirates followed was that diluted rum, mixed with water, was safer to drink than pure seawater or potentially contaminated freshwater barrels. Pirate ships typically carried barrels with about 63 gallons of rum, and the standard daily ration per sailor was about a half pint, often split into 2 servings. This practice, known as the grog ration, started under the British Navy but quickly became pirate policy for hydration and morale. That said, overconsumption led to drunkenness, and humans being humans, that meant sloppy sword fights and lost treasure maps. A hilarious but true anecdote involves Captain Bartholomew Roberts, nicknamed Black Bart, who in 1617 ordered a strict rum ration discipline on his ship. The idea was to prevent the crew from turning into drunken disasters. He implemented a system to dilute rum with water so that the crew consumed only a small amount of alcohol, but enough liquid to stave off thirst. Roberts even punished those caught sneaking pure rum bottles. Ironically, his policy improved survival rates, but caused a small mutiny when pirates got wind of their watered-down rum juice. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation with watered-down drinks. Speaking of survival hacks, pirates also had a surprising trick they borrowed from earlier sailors and explorers: collecting dew. Sounds odd, right? But collecting dew from sails and rigging during early mornings was a way to gather tiny amounts of fresh water. Think of it like nature's mini water refill station. It was messy, slow, and yielded only small amounts. But when you need every drop to keep your crew alive, that cup of water condensed on morning rigging could make the difference between life and near death. Again, nothing glamorous here. Dew harvesting meant licking salty ropes or wiping damp canvas, because nothing says fearsome like your beard smelling like wet hemp. What pirates didn't know then, but modern science confirms, is that these methods, though rudimentary, were based on solid principles. Collecting rainwater reduces salt intake to 0. Heating seawater causes evaporation, which separates salt from liquid. And the water content in fruits offers vital hydration and electrolytes. Even diluted rum provided some defense against waterborne germs that were a constant threat in unclean barrels. These are the ancient ancestors of our modern water purification systems, packed into the gutsy, gritty lifestyle of pirates constantly battling dehydration on the open sea. Now, here's something really wild. Pirates sometimes tried holding tightly to the idea that seawater could be sweetened, or made drinkable by mixing it with rainwater or freshwater from captured ships. In theory, a 50-50 mix could reduce salt content enough to avoid immediate kidney damage. But let's be honest, that was basically playing water roulette with your health. Pirates who gambled on this method often ended up professions in vague seasickness or worse. There's one report from a privateer in 1699 describing how his crew, mingled seawater with their rainwater to save precious barrels, only for half of the men to suffer severe dehydration symptoms within days. At least it was a communal disaster. And then there's the old-timey practice pirates sometimes use that sounds straight out of a gross-out survival guide. Drinking from the ship's bilge, the area under the deck where waste and seawater collected after storms. Readers, it was vile. Think algae, oily scum, wormy bits, and a microbial commune of heaven only knows what. Yet stories survive of crews forced to drink bilge water in dangers so dire that survival outweighed taste or dignity. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation with a mouthful of shipyard sludge. If there were a pirate slogan for this, it'd be "Desperate times call for desperate slurps." So, the takeaway here is that pirates' relationship with water was a relentless, often icky, uphill battle. They combined trial and error, nature's gifts, makeshift distilling, and even alcohol abuse, all in an effort to keep 50 men hydrated on a rocking, salty death trap of wood and sails. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't always effective, but it was resourceful. Turns out, surviving on seawater isn't about drinking it at all, but finding clever ways to trick nature into giving you the good stuff for just long enough to keep casting off and hunting treasure. Hold on tight, because up next we're diving into even grosser survival hacks and how pirates managed to stretch every drop of water on the harshest of seas, including a story about a pirate ship that almost sank from dehydration before the crew discovered a genius but terrifying water source. Ready for the salty truth? Stick around. All right, buckle up, because now we're diving even deeper into the mad world of pirate water survival, where desperation bred innovation and sometimes just plain bad ideas. So you've got your rain catchers, your weird distillers, coconuts, diluted grog, and dew scraping off rigging. But the story doesn't end there. Pirates were masters of stretching resources, and when those ran out, well, their options got downright desperate and imaginative. Ever wonder what pirates did when their water barrels not only ran dry, but also turned into brewing vats for unwelcome guests? Yeah, let's talk about that. Barrels of fresh water on a ship might sound simple enough. Fill them up, drink away, repeat. But sailing isn't exactly a spa retreat. Remember how I mentioned the nasty slime and sometimes even little critters taking up residence in the pirates' precious water barrels? Turns out, these barrels, often made from oak and sealed with pitch, were perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and microscopic life, especially once the water sat for 24 to 48 hours. Pirates didn't have underwater microbial awareness, but they sure had complaints about their funk water. Drinking, that was like Russian roulette with your insides. Sometimes you get lucky, other times, well, let's just say your stomach would revolt harder than a mutiny. But here's where cleverness meets gross. Pirates learned to mitigate the rot a bit by tossing in things like charcoal or lime to keep water fresher. Not exactly trendy water purification tablets, but hey, those little bits helped absorb some odors and impurities. Basically nature's early breed of filter. Charcoal's porous nature traps impurities, and lime's acidity slows bacterial growth. These were simple chemical hacks passed down from seafarers and even ancient Romans, adapted for a pirate's budget. Not perfect, but better than gulping down greenish swamp juice. It wasn't uncommon to see pirates trading for lime or shellfish shells at friendly ports just to toss in their water barrels, hoping against hope to avoid the dreaded glass of death. Aka the barrel water that could knock you on your ass. But barrels didn't just harbor bacteria. They were also dangerously vulnerable to seawater contamination during storms or rough sailing. Picture a raging Caribbean squall tossing your ship like a toy, splashing salt water through the cracks of poorly sealed barrels. Spoiler alert, barrels didn't love being soaked in salt, and even a splash could raise that salt content enough to mess with your kidneys. Pirates of the early 18th century referred to this phenomenon as sailor's compound, or the brackish curse, and it could mean the difference between making landfall hydrated or in dire straits. Now let's get weird. You think dew collection on rigging was odd? Wait until you hear how some crews tried breathing moisture out of the air below deck. Yeah, sounds like science fiction, but desperate times led to desperate hacks. Some pirates reportedly used layers of canvas and other sailcloth to trap humidity inside enclosed areas like cargo holds overnight, draining collected water each morning. Basically, makeshift atmospheric condensers built by pirates in the dark, while dodging both storms and enemy ships. Not super efficient, yielding maybe a pint or two per day. And as anyone who's ever slept in a sponge knows, it was damp and moldy below deck. But hey, a cup of semi-fresh water beats salty death any day. You gotta admire their grit, or their sheer ability to suck up a lot of humidity with an ironic grin. Speaking of ingenuity bordering desperation, here's a gross gem. Pirates sometimes resorted to what I like to call ditch water recycling. After cooking or washing, water wasn't simply dumped overboard. Sometimes it was reused multiple times before being discarded. This practice might make a modern-day barfly clutch his stomach, but with barrels running low and no rain in sight, every drop counted. Pirates would filter this so-called gray water through layers of cloth or sand, trying to wring out whatever clean water could be salvaged. Of course, the results were patchy, and the smell. That's a whole other story involving hardened noses and a healthy disregard for personal comfort. But this crude recycling could yield enough water to keep a few sailors from keeling over, which, when your life depends on it, counts as a win. Now, since pirates were all about plunder and capturing enemy ships, here's an unexpected lifesaver: booty water. No, not treasure chests filled with water, but rather capturing freshwater supplies from enemy vessels, especially Spanish galleons sailing the Caribbean, which were known for their rigorous provisioning. Pirates would seize barrels of fresh water from these ships, effectively replenishing their own supplies. You might think it was straightforward, but these barrels sometimes came with one problem: water spoilage or contamination from long storage or battle damage. Pirates had to be on their toes, tasting and testing before giving the crew a big swig. Some smart cookies took to rotating these captured water stores, using the freshest first, then letting the older barrels serve for cooking or washing only. Logistics on a pirate ship were surprisingly sophisticated. We also can't forget the role of salt pork and dried foods in this watery saga. You might be wondering, how does food help with hydration? Well, salted meats aren't exactly renowned for their water content, but consuming them caused pirates to crave more water, which was terrible when stocks ran low. To counteract this, pirates tried to soak the salted pork in their limited water supply, both to make it edible and to wring some extra hydration from it. This soaking water was then used carefully, either strained for cooking or sometimes, after brief rest periods, even sipped cautiously. Think of it as the pirate precursor to a stew or broth, but way messier and with a side of salt-induced misery. Not the glamorous gourmet you might imagine, but practical as heck. And now, a true standout in pirate water lore: the tale of the ship Fancy, captained by Henry Every in the late 1690s. After months without a port and facing near mutiny due to dehydration, the crew stumbled upon a bizarre but effective survival hack: drinking seawater early in the voyage, yes, but mixed with rainwater and a bit of oyster juice from freshly captured shellfish. Turns out, oyster juice, kind of like a natural electrolyte drink, helped counteract some of the damaging effects of salt. Pirates didn't know electrolytes, of course, but they noticed that those who drank this mixture fared better. Whether this was science or superstition, it bought the Fancy enough time to reach a friendly island and refill their water barrels. The story's takeaway: sometimes nature offers solutions hiding in plain sight, or on the bottom of the ocean. Finally, a little science nugget pirates never realized: the role temperature played in hydration and water preservation. Pirates sailing through the blazing Caribbean sun had to contend not just with salt, but with heat increasing evaporation and encouraging bacteria to grow in stored water barrels. To combat this, pirates cleverly stored their barrels deep in the ship's hold where temperatures were cooler, and the sun's UV rays couldn't speed up bacterial multiplication. They didn't call it cool storage, but it was the 17th century equivalent of your fridge. Not perfect, but it slowed water spoilage from the average 48 hours to sometimes 3 or 4 days. Just don't ask what happened if the ship rocked too much and barrels leaked. Those days usually ended in a soggy, salty disaster. So there it is. Pirates' watery odyssey wasn't just about avoiding the obvious "don't drink seawater" rule. It was an evolving mix of trial, error, and a surprisingly low tolerance for dignity when survival was on the line. From tossing lime and charcoal into barrels, scavenging dew off sails, mucking through recycled cooking water, to harvesting electrolytes from oysters and even smart storage strategies below deck. These sea rogues were basically the original, if slightly foul-smelling, water scientists. Next time you watch a pirate movie and see someone swigging rum or guzzling straight from a barrel, remember the grim reality hidden beneath the swagger. A relentless, sticky battle against dehydration, terrible tastes, and enough slime to make a barnacle blush. Cheers to pirates, masters of salty survival, even if it meant occasionally licking wet ropes and drinking the glass of death, just to keep sailing another day. All right, matey, let's keep this treasure chest of salty survival stories open, because pirates didn't just stop at rain barrels and distillers. They got creative, they got desperate, and sometimes they got downright weird to keep water flowing on those creaky wooden death traps bobbing in the big blue. Remember, 50 men each needing about 1 gallon daily. That's a whopping 50 gallons a day. And the ocean was more stingy than a miser with gold doubloons. You might think, well, why not just catch seawater and hope for the best? Bad idea. Really bad. Drinking seawater with that 3.5% salt content is like chugging poison. It dehydrates and mostly guarantees that the kidneys will scream mutiny before you hit the second grog ration. Pirates quickly learned that salty water meant blurred vision, hallucinations, and sometimes a death march to Davy Jones' locker. So when barrels ran dry or soured into green goo filled with worms and who knows what, crews turned to all sorts of grim solutions. Here's where it gets interesting. Pirates came up with the world's earliest versions of water purification science, without a single white coat in sight. One surprisingly successful hack was tossing charcoal into water barrels. Charcoal, with its porous magic, absorbs toxins and smells. Think of it as the 17th century Brita filter. While not exactly spa quality, this trick could delay the onset of the dreaded glass of death, the nickname for sludgy barrel water so foul it could knock out a seasoned pirate in one gulp. Charcoal's rank smell-trapping powers gave enough breathing room for crews to stretch their water stocks by days, sometimes up to 4 before the barrels turned against them. Lime worked too, though it smelled like a forgotten citrus basket left in the sun, lowering pH enough to slow bacteria. A handy, if slightly stinky, microbiologist's dream. Of course, keeping barrels uncontaminated was a fight in itself. Storms would pummel those barrels, splashing salt water through cracks and breaches. Pirates called this disaster the brackish curse, because a splash of salt could turn fresh water into vaguely drinkable seawaterish nastiness. Once infected, barrels might as well be cursed treasure chests, empty or toxic. One pirate log from a Caribbean squall in the late 1700s tells how a sudden storm flooded their prime water barrels, leaving the crew desperate and on edge within days. This brackish curse wasn't just gross. It meant shorter voyages, decreased combat readiness, and a lot more of those any last words, moments before battle. Now for the downright bizarre, the pirates' version of water desalination, sometimes called air water, involved capturing moisture from the atmosphere below decks. Sounds like a sci-fi survival hack, right? But desperate pirates sealed damp sailcloth and canvas in cargo holds overnight, waiting for sticky humidity to condense into actual water on hidden surfaces. Each morning they'd wring out a few pints, barely enough to prevent complete collapse, but still better than salty death. Imagine licking wet sails or squeezing damp cloth for a sip. It wasn't glamorous, but man, it beats curling up in a dehydrated ball complaining about the half a pint of pirate spit you just gulped down. Then there's ditch water recycling. After cooking and washing, pirates didn't immediately toss out used water. Instead, they filtered the stuff through cloth or sand, wringing out whatever less potent horror could be squeezed back into drinkable form. Picture a ragged, crusty sponge absorbing salt pork drippings and scrub water, all with the noble purpose of saving lives. Talk about the phrase waste not, want not, escalating to suck it up or die. Not exactly a pampering spa treatment, but better than nothing when your throat feels like a desert and the next mutiny feels closer than your next drink. Booty water, not a euphemism, sadly, but a real thing pirates depended on. Capturing fresh water stores from enemy Spanish galleons was like hitting the hydration jackpot. Spanish ships were notoriously well provisioned. Their water barrels were prized loot. Pirates had to be like water sommeliers, though, tasting and testing barrels for spoilage or damage before doling out sips to the crew. Some pirates developed surprisingly savvy rotation strategies, drinking the freshest captured water first and relegating older barrels to cooking or washing. It sounds organized, but remember, this all happened in between duels and dodging cannonballs, so hats off to these water logisticians of the high seas. Speaking of eating, salted provisions were a double-edged sword. Salt pork and hardtack formed the backbone of pirate diets, but salt is a notorious thirst maker. Eating a mouthful of salty meat without water is like seasoning your tongue with fire. Pirates soaked these meats in whatever clean water they could muster, softening the torture and gaining an extra few sips from the residual soak. Sometimes this meat-infused water was strained and cautiously sipped, kind of like the rough draft of a stew. Not exactly Jamie Oliver's finest, but hey, liquid gold for those starving pirates. A legendary example of ingenuity, or mad science, comes from the infamous pirate Henry Every and his ship Fancy. Facing near mutiny around the late 1690s because of creeping dehydration, the crew hit upon a wild survival hack, mixing seawater with rainwater and oyster juice. Yup, oyster juice, a natural electrolyte-rich brine, acted almost like primitive sports drinks, buffering the salt's damage. Pirates didn't have modern electrolyte science, but they noticed that sailors chugging this slippery concoction were noticeably perkier and less prone to crumple under the salt's dehydrating assault. Their oyster electrolyte cocktail kept them alive just long enough to reach a friendly island for proper water refills. Science or luck, doesn't matter, it worked. And when you're clinging to life on the ocean, a little superstition is a fine friend. Temperature played a sneaky role too. In the blazing sun of the Caribbean, barrels under the open sun turned into bacterial breeding grounds faster than you could say barnacle cake. Pirates cleverly stashed water barrels deep in the ship's hold, where it was cooler and darker, slowing bacterial growth from roughly 2 days to sometimes up to 4. Not ice cold or filtered, but you take what you can get. Of course, rough seas could knock barrels loose, spreading their contents into soggy, salty puddles on the ship's floor. Instant pirate party pooper. Still, this ancient version of refrigeration was crucial. It's basically the 17th century mini fridge, minus the electric hum and the ice cream. All these survival hacks were built on hard lessons in failure. For every bucket of rainwater filled with Captain's Revenge grease, there was a barrel of glass of death, water bubbling with tiny worms or the mysterious green gunk that turned the ship's hold into a slimy Petri dish. For every homemade still cooked on the galley stove, there were drunken sailors swearing off sea witches brewed forever. For every saved barrel of booty water, there was a storm shaking salt into the mix and turning life-threatening. Pirates weren't just fighting rival ships, they fought rot, thirst, and their own gag reflex on a daily basis. And yet, despite the taste disasters, the grimy cleanup jobs, and the occasional mutiny over watered-down grog, pirates mastered a basic truth. Survival on the ocean wasn't about brute force or sheer luck. It was about science, accidental, sticky, and gross, but real science nonetheless. Their mix of rain catchers, distillers, charcoal filters, dew harvesters, redeemers of ditch water, and even electrolyte experimentation was a gritty, smelly, genius cocktail that kept them afloat longer than anyone expected. So next time you see a pirate movie and watch someone swagger with a bottle of rum or sip suspicious barrel water, remember the real story behind that swig. A relentless, often revolting struggle against dehydration, salt poisoning, and stinky water barrel mutinies. Pirates were less about high seas bravado and more about becoming the original, if slightly gross, water scientists of the ocean. They didn't just drink seawater. They beat it at its own salty game using everything from oyster juice to charcoal bits, proving that sometimes surviving on the open sea takes equal parts grit, gut, and grimy genius. In the end, the deadliest challenge wasn't the enemy but finding a clean sip of water to keep swashbuckling another day. Cheers to that salty truth.